Good afternoon. My name's Roger Cunningham, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar this afternoon on curriculum reform. I've titled this presentation Busy Going Nowhere, to reflect what I see as a disappointing story of persistent failures to bring about change, not just across this region, but much of the developing world. This webinar and the think piece I have shared does not offer any magic bullet. To many, it may seem overly negative and contentious. Many may disagree and point to examples that present a different story. What I hope this piece will do is open up discussion and help us look at and think about curriculum reform in a way that helps us move things forward in a more constructive and optimistic way. Let's start by having a look at the challenge. We have to start with a now widely accepted challenge that despite huge improvements in access to basic education across the developing world, massive numbers of children simply fail to master even the basic levels of literacy and numeracy. Described as the learning crisis, this is the number one challenge across all education systems, and therefore surely the number one challenge for curriculum reform. It is estimated that half of the ESR countries, less than 10% of primary age children will attain basic standards of learning, and in no country is it more than 50%. There's lots of arguments about this and haggling over the detail, but we're fighting for scraps here. It's a full-blown crisis, whatever way you look at it, and no matter whose results you read. Curriculum reform efforts seem to have largely ignored the wider failures within education systems, that the several bits that need to be working are actually not working. Dysfunction is overlooked, forgotten, and curriculum reform often built on illusions that things are working well. The aspirations of curriculum reform, therefore, often exceed, in many cases wildly, the capacity of the wider system to deliver. The result is failure, and the desired change simply doesn't happen. It might be useful at this point to have a quick overview of what we mean by curriculum reform. This think piece and webinar is not a technical exposition of the concepts, theories and processes of curriculum development as such. And as I developed this PowerPoint out of the think piece, I felt there was a gap which I hope that this slide helps to plug. It's based on some useful work from UNESCO, so it's probably familiar to you. It helps us think about what we mean by curriculum reform. Essentially, curriculum reform is about change that makes schooling more relevant to present, which are known, and future, which are largely unknown, needs. It's the fit between education and society. Essentially, there are three dimensions of the curriculum, and curriculum reform has to embrace all of these if it's to be effective. Firstly, there's the intended curriculum. This is what we want learners to know, to understand, and to be able to do. And typically this is expressed in curriculum documents and often in a curriculum framework. Secondly, there's the implemented curriculum. This is actually what happens in the classroom. This is evidenced through observation and through evaluation. And thirdly, there's the achieved curriculum. This is what learners know, what they understand, and what they can actually do. And this is measured through assessment, through typically tests and examinations. It's also important to remember that curriculum reform is largely politically driven. It's a response to a national discourse around economic and social transformation, and it becomes a response from within the education system to these much broader felt and perceived needs. It's essentially about ensuring a nation has the right human capital for its development. So why does so much curriculum reform fail? I think there are two main reasons why most curriculum reform endeavours fail to bring about the desired change, and these are closely interrelated. Firstly, reform is often too ambitious and complicated for the capacity of the system, particularly with regard to teachers' skills, attitudes and behaviours. In particular, when it comes to issues around competency-based or learning-centred approaches, there is a real risk of confusion and the critical focus on fundamental basic skills can easily get lost. Secondly, too often the framework, the intended curriculum, is developed without sufficient regard to the changes needed in the rest of the system that are necessary for effective implementation. Curriculum reform is about whole system change if the intended is to get implemented and achieved. And unfortunately, simultaneous reform across the critical parts of the system is rarely achieved. Little wonder then that results are so often disappointing, reform is partial and often stalls, frustration sets in, classroom practice remains largely unchanged, and learning does not improve. In the previous slide, I referred to different bits of the education system. In order for the curriculum to be effectively implemented and achieved, 4 major members of the delivery family have to be factored into the curriculum framework design. Careful consideration has to be given to how effective these areas currently are and what is needed as part of the reform process and how these realities might constrain what is intended. These 4 areas are teacher training and support, which is vital in terms of how the curriculum becomes implemented. It's about teaching and learning materials, again equally important in terms of the implementation of the curriculum, the right materials in place at the right time. It's about school environment and leadership. What is the overall context in schools in which the curriculum is to be implemented? And finally, the 4th member of this family is the examination and assessment process and function, which ultimately will be responsible for assessing whether the curriculum is actually achieved or not. Curriculum reform, therefore, must be a fully inclusive process that engages across all of these areas, involving honest assessment of capacity and performance, including resourcing, as well as what might feasibly be done to improve this. In the next couple of slides, we'll highlight some of the factors within each of these areas that contribute to curriculum reform failures. So let's have a look at some of these factors that contribute to failure. Firstly, there is the issue of political aspiration versus ground reality. Economic transformation to what are often called knowledge-based economies are often simply beyond existing education systems' capability in many developing country contexts. Interpreting this in terms of what we expect children to do and schools to deliver is fraught with risk. It's uncharted territory in many cases. The story of ICT in schools is one such example. Underlying cultures and practices of teachers and teaching are firmly rooted in teacher-centric didactic methods with a focus on teaching, not learning. Changing this has proved very difficult. Frequently, there are insufficient teaching and learning resources made available at the right time to enable change. Familiar stories, a lack of funds and poor procurement processes. There is also often an overestimation of teachers' creativity and their ability to develop their own classroom resources often required by the new curriculum. We still seem set on measuring success here by pupil textbook ratios and not the actual use or utility of materials provided. Examination and assessment reform often lags behind curriculum change. We know the effects of major tests or examinations on the system, so not changing how learning is assessed exerts a strong counterweight to curriculum change. Assessment of competencies may be heavily reliant on forms of continuous assessment, and system capacity for this is weak. Despite some success in shifting to mother tongue instruction in early grades in many countries, one area of success in recent years, The lack of materials and teacher proficiency has hindered progress, and results remain variable and, in places, disappointing. This remains also a politically very sensitive area. Curriculum units generally suffer from weak capacity. They are rarely the strong suit in any education system. They are frequently sidelined and fail to secure adequate resources. Until some externally funded project comes along, they are often silent, isolated, and out of touch. They are also often under and/or poorly staffed. High flyers are rarely posted to curriculum departments. They have little influence or power within the system. There are often very poor institutional relationships among the key entities that we've looked at in previous slides. There is a tendency towards operating in silos with poor collaboration. In part, this is a result of competition for resources, resulting in little incentive to change. Even where attempts have been made to break these silos, for example in Rwanda through the creation of the Rwanda Education Board, real collaboration remains a problem. Curriculum reform is very often externally funded and driven. There are very real risks around policy borrowing in curriculum reform and adopting approaches and concepts from more developed contexts. This applies to many aspects of education reform and development more generally. This may often be quite subtle, for example, study tours to see advanced reform or perhaps similar challenges but not tested solutions that simply increases the gap between aspiration and reality. And finally, schemes of work. These are often the backbone of teacher assessment and appraisal practices, and they can be particularly conservative influence that resists change. Pretty well all curriculum reform sets out to make classrooms more child-centred, moving towards child-centred learning. This age-old system of schemes of work guarantees that classrooms remain teacher-centred, delivering lessons in line with the curriculum framework, but not in line with what learners can do. What happens is that the curriculum pulls away from the child. So what are some of the main considerations and risks we need to think about when embarking on curriculum reform so as not to continue to repeat past mistakes and to achieve better outcomes? There are obvious risks if we ignore these. Let's look across the various bits of the family. Firstly, teachers and teaching. If we're not realistic about the current status of teachers and their teaching, reform will falter and likely fail. Are we being realistic about their motivation and capability? Are they likely to embrace change, see the challenge as an opportunity, or will they prefer to be left alone? Then there are practical issues around teacher deployment and attendance. Are intended changes feasible in the light of pupil-teacher ratios or what we know about time on task, for example? Next, let's look at teacher training, both initial and in service. What immediate reorientation and training will serving teachers need? This is very often constrained by available resources, both money and time, and not based on a realistic estimate of actual need. Who will deliver this? Is there sufficient capacity? And how will they be made fit for purpose? How will teacher training institutions adopt and accept the change? Teacher training institutions are very often ignored in the process of curriculum reform. At best, it's tacked on as an afterthought and they're left to work it out for themselves. Consequently, they fail to change their curriculum at the same time and churn out teachers unprepared for the curriculum that they will be required to deliver. Textbooks and other materials have to be developed and be in place at the start of implementation, or teachers and learners will be left stranded. Are the processes for developing and producing essential materials clear, and do they align to the phasing in of the new curriculum? Have budgets taken account of scale? If we are continuing or moving to a mother tongue curriculum in early grades, has the development of materials and the recruitment of teachers with the right language in the major languages been factored in? And what about minority languages? What happens here? Moving on to the all-important front line, the school environment and the prevailing conditions under which a new curriculum will be delivered. What is the status and effectiveness of school leadership, and how will it be prepared and supported to see the required change? How often is this given adequate attention in the preparation and rollout of curriculum reform? And what about classrooms themselves? Has class size, overcrowding and pupil-teacher ratios been factored into how we see change to teaching and learning? Will teachers be able to adapt the preferred pedagogies to the reality of large class sizes? We've all witnessed the lunacy of an ill-prepared teacher trying to manage group work with 100 or more children crammed into a room built for 50. Are the effects of high-stake examinations on the system honestly acknowledged? This really is such a critical area in determining the likely success of reform. Is there willingness, capacity and resources to concurrently adapt these and other assessments to the new curricula to avoid the inevitable lag? If continuous assessment in some form or another is being proposed, what is the assessed capacity of teachers to be able to do this effectively, and have all the perverse incentives been acknowledged? Finally, going back to the previous points, and one that I did not make strongly enough in the think piece perhaps, there is the important issue of the institutional coherence across the entities or agencies who have to be actively engaged in curriculum reform. This is the glue that binds effective reform. Do we understand these interrelationships? To what extent is there a silo mentality and culture? Have we assessed the risks of these poor relationships to the path and outcomes of planned reform? It's very easy and comfortable to ignore all this, and very dangerous. Some good old tools of institutional and political economy analysis can be very useful here. Here are 7 things that we, partners and ministries, might do well to consider at the start of and during the curriculum reform process, and I'm sure there may be many more. Assess the system's capacity to deliver and design according to what is and not what ought to be. Do the groundwork well before. Build on existing analysis. Make the case for a readiness to reform appraisal that clearly flags risks. This might be tough and unpopular, but it's well worth it. Develop strategies to address risks. Do a thorough risk analysis. Test out intended scenarios and agree ways in which risks can be mitigated. Consider phasing in change. Often the scale of curriculum reform is simply too ambitious. There are many obvious advantages to going slow. It minimises stress on the system, it allows for learning and for adaptation to influence the further rollout. Estimate total resources and ensure that they are available at the start. This requires some serious budgeting and development of different scenarios. Make sure everyone, especially those beyond education, ministries of finance, economic planning, etc., are aware of the full costs and prepared to put resources in place. Scale back reform if necessary. Identify quick wins so confidence is built through success. Frustration and cynicism sets in quickly when reform stalls for whatever reason. Invest in trials and pilots to show that things can work. Fully engage all stakeholders from the start. Make sure that initial reform discussion and planning fully involve the entire family. This has to be more than lip service or simple consultation, and be genuine, practical collaboration so that reform is owned and driven by all parties. And finally, communicate, internally and externally. Failure to do this results in disaffection and negativity. Keep everyone within the education system, as well as the general public, informed about what is planned and what is happening. Manage both understanding and expectation. Ultimately, successful curriculum reform comes down to better managing expectations. The fundamental and obvious caveat behind all of this is not to develop a curriculum that is beyond the system's capacity to deliver. So, to quickly round off, there's no magic bullet. Curriculum reform is complex and it's a whole system thing. It's not just about working with curriculum people, but supporting them to engage meaningfully with other bits of the system. It's about opening up silos. Don't ignore context and culture. Things are as they are for a reason, and wounds in the system will not self-heal. The best predictor of the future is the present. Recognise how things work or don't work, and understand why. Sudden and sweeping change on the back of a new curriculum framework will not happen if the underlying causes of what's wrong are ignored. Prepare. Devote more time and resources to assessing readiness for change, and keep stress testing as you go. Don't rush down the path of hope over expedience. Plan. Things will always take longer and cost more. Get budgets agreed and secured up front. Don't lose sight of the core objective of promoting the foundational basics of literacy and numeracy, the overriding challenge that underpins all else. And finally, think inclusion. At the heart of curriculum reform has to be the move from learning for a few, the present 10 to 50%, to learning for all. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.